Now, in consideration of that, I am looking at what I have left of my work as IAG, and I had a couple of reports that I had were kind of like the beginning of some investigations, and then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 12. I have 14 days worth of reports out of what were at least 45. There may have been up to 60 by the time they got stolen. And so some of these had like nascent legal theories, and some of them had actual evidence that I was, acquiring real time. It's kind of like I was going through the process of analyzing how to pursue things, what to do in terms of certain kinds of situations. And one of the reports I wrote that I cannot find at the immediate moment, but was definitely done within the first 30 days. I actually thought it was one of the first 5 days. And so one of the major things that I was analyzing had to do with databases. Now, the writ for quo warranto, or writ for quo warranto, I submitted before the Supreme Court of Texas specifically talked about a nascent kind of analysis and attempted an examination of the use of specific kinds of databases and how databases could be disabused for acts of trafficking and other crimes. I specifically referenced databases connected to DAPA and DACA, and how the internment of people that had been alleged to have been part of an increase of immigrants to the U.S. Mexico border could potentially be disabused, and there were constitutional arguments therein. But when I first started analyzing this, part of what it did is it had to do with a process I had gone through before this time frame. It was earlier in the year, where I was analyzing my theory that what had happened when I had been kidnapped is that somebody who thought they were fancy ass, some snark ass lawyer, thinks he knows things, was taking certain legal concepts of either people's property or the concept of property rights, and would create either derivatives or would make an inventory of somebody's human capital, somebody's past, somebody's experiences, and it would basically sell them, would either sell them or lease them, and would play some sort of twisted kind of S&M game where you're my slave and I'm going to rent out this right to somebody else. So somebody else has a claim to your performance or your experiences with this right. I literally believe that the only thing that could explain what I was experiencing at the time, and potentially a systematology for understanding what I was observing in terms of the experiences other women were having, specifically at these shelters, was something akin to that. That there was some sadistic lawyer or group of lawyers that would literally do these sorts of things. And they would literally create inventories of people's human capital, and they would either use them personally, or they would create some manner in which they could be loaned out or they could be leased out. And my concern was that what was happening was that this that venture capital investment in so-called mental health treatment that I'd been told about by somebody who identified himself not only as a lawyer but as somebody who had formerly worked for the State Department in Illinois. He told me about how he had participated in a meeting held at the behest of the governor concerning mental health treatment in Illinois, and the processes whereby venture capitalists were going to be investing in mental health treatment paradigms with an understanding that if there was a specific kind of benchmark that had been met by the people or the person that had been involved with the treatment paradigm, then that VC would get something back, that they would get a return on their investment in somebody's mental health treatment. Okay, and so this was a conversation, and this had been brought to my attention. Things that happened after that, however, made me seriously question whether that was even legal, and if the intent behind exposing that to me and or the intent behind that paradigm being set up was actually to intentionally attempt to recruit people to engage in illegal activity with the understanding that they could use the concept of them being mentally ill or being in mental health treatment as some sort of cover, up to and including potentially a legal defense in the event that they were caught or that they were put into a situation for prosecution, i.e., they lacked mental capacity to be held accountable for their crime. and that this was almost an incentive for VCs to try to acquire people that were highly functioning otherwise, but that were subjected to either some sort of gaslighting or actually had some sort of other reason to have a experience in terms of cognitive dissonance, and that it would be manipulated in order to create circumstances that would try to compel that person to engage in illegal activity, with an understanding that the VC may not even have to be acknowledged as being a participant in this process, but at some point would be able to get their return based upon whether or not that person cooperated with certain benchmarks that had been set up. And so my concern was that this is what I was seeing, and that they were trying to get me to agree, and the understanding was you go through it yourself, and that at a certain point you're going to get out of it, and then you're going to get to do it. You'll get your own girls, you'll get your own boys, and then you'll be able to run them through the racket. And then when you'll be able to set up benchmarks, and then they'll be your runners, and then when they hit those benchmarks, you'll get your return. And that this is what these VCs were setting up. Well, the problem is with that, A, what is actually providing the foundation, and B, there's totally, absolutely questions about mental capacity to engage a contract for that kind of relationship to begin with. Who in the venture capital world thought it was a good idea to specifically prey upon people that were alleged to have a problem with engaging in contracts because they had a mental illness or they had some sort of impairment that impacted their capacity to make informed decisions about their lives? This is the whole premise around which somebody is identified as having the kind of situation going on that would make them qualified. So the very things that qualify you should be the very things that disqualify the VC, is what I'm saying. It doesn't make any sense unless, of course, what you're trying to do is create a subversive paradigm for trying to entice and or extort people into cooperating with illicit activity, with an understanding that you're going to be able to use healthcare as not only a cover in terms of literal insurance, but also a cover in the event that there is any exposure of that crime, and then that person, by virtue of being in a situation of mental incapacity, would have some sort of capability to be absolved of having to be held criminally accountable for their role. So in the course of that, functionally speaking, well, how would this operate? So I'd come up with a spreadsheet, which I still have. It got lost for a while, and then I found it again, where I took my very basic rudimentary understanding of what was considered to be common law rights to property, mapped it out to see, okay, so if you understand that these are concepts of what are property rights, and then what could be used as a person's personal history, a person's various experiences. It's like when you go to these shelters, they set you up in a program. Can the elements and the benchmarks in the program be associated with an inventory of your property? And then can that be used as a process? Can a process be set up whereby you're going in your life third dimensionally to whatever they've programmed you as being your requirements or being what's available to you, and somebody else is assigning or ascribing or claiming your actual property in accordance with a particular systematology that they get to use for their advantage, maybe as a loan, maybe as a lease, so that they can actually use those times that you're meeting those benchmarks connected to your program as some manner in which they are actually getting credit. They're actually getting credit for you going there. So if you meet your benchmarks and you do things the way you're supposed to do it, and you work their deals in a completely abstracted, non-verified way, and then they end up meeting their benchmarks concurrently to using yours, then they've been determined to have succeeded. Now, the whole process is exploitative as hell, and you never tell anybody who you are. You never tell anybody what the sector is you're working with. You never tell them what the leverage is. You never tell them what the expectation is. You don't give them time frames. You don't check in to make sure that they're okay. And what happens if there is a dissonance? What happens if you're meeting your benchmarks and you're going to your programs and that guy over there just got a big deal and he has to dump? Well, what determines who and how he dumps it? Because what I was concerned about is that there was a very racialized paradigm in which these VCs are working. And that depending upon what it is they're working with, or what asset it is they're working with, certain people in certain demographics are allowed to be the dump for that particular thing. And there's a risk weighting that gives certain kinds of people with certain demographics a specific kind of value. Hence, the middle-aged white nuke bitch. right? Hence there's these archetypes you see on the street, or part of paradigms, because it's not just the individual VC. That individual VC is part of a system, including a potential like financing system for the local municipality that's part of a public financing regime that's also functioning. It also has its benchmarks, and its benchmarks are also based on programmatic regimes that have tokens. You have I'll give you a very common one I see very frequently. Within a rotation of a particular period of time that correlates with increased assets of a particular kind to a homeless shelter, first you get the security guard actually from Africa. He has a particular disposition. He speaks softly. He has kind of an accent. He's kind of aloof, kind of withdrawn. At some point, he gets changed over, and then you've got the African American, who's a little louder. He's a little more joking with the guys, like he's one of the guys. And if you're, one of the women there and one of the guys starts messing with you, he has a very different comportment than the actual African guy. This is a program. And I think it happens, it's in some manner, way, shape, or form, a part of a particular paradigm that somebody has specific to a financing regime. And it's not, I've seen it in Dallas and I've seen it in Houston, where they literally did the same thing. That the actual physical security guard is at certain times in the cycle an actual man from Africa. And then he ends up leaving and they replace him with an actual African-American man. And the understanding is when that African-American man comes in, it's like there's a greater familiarity between him and the other men specifically. And then there's also an understanding of a little bit more of a risque factor. That you don't got, there's a different understanding of the expectation of behavior, and there's a different understanding of what you can get away with. And so if you're the white nuke bitch, you're going to have a very different experience, and that's intentional. That's what I'm talking about. Whoever it is that's working these routines, where they've got these people going around in these cycles, and they're using them as assets in these kind of remote deals. We never got to consent. We never get checked in with. And see, now I've been in a situation where since I've come to Dallas, when I first got to Dallas, I had 3 times I had to call 3 times I had an encounter with a man, and it was very formulaic. I knew it. It made me angry. I felt personally insulted, and I was physically violated. But it was too cyclical. It was too contrived. As much as I was angry at him, and as much as I really wanted to kick his ass or have somebody should kick his ass, he shouldn't be allowed to do that. This is too contrived. And every time, all 3 times, it was both connected to the chief of police in Dallas, and it also had something that resonated with a current directly connected to Nigeria. In the moment, he touched me. First time he slapped me across the face, and then the second time he jumped on my back from behind and he grabbed my breast and he started groping my breast. And so both times he followed me out of the building. He chased me. He went down the street. He started harassing me verbally from behind. And then I would try to de-escalate. And he wasn't going to de-escalate. This was the understanding. And so the first time he had a bike, he rode the bike up to me. I tried to get out of his way, and then he got off the bike and he slapped me across the face. It was a hard slap. And then the second time I'm walking down the street, and he just comes up behind me, and he just runs up behind me, jumps on my back, grabs my breast, and he says something, right? But I could feel when he actually made contact with me, there was all kinds of communication. And the first layer was directly connected to some sort of male-type consciousness, but was still identifiable as also the female consciousness or the female current associated with the chief of police here in Dallas. And then after that was all of this stuff specific to Nigeria. And the third time, he did the same thing. He was chasing me. I left. He was following me out. He was yelling at me. And so I started yelling at the people at the building because we were close enough that other people were. I was like, is somebody going to stop him? Is somebody going to say something and stop this guy? He's already, assaulted me. He's running out of here. He's yelling at me. Are you going to say it? And nobody said anything. Some people laughed. So I went back to the building. When I went back to the building, the police showed up. When the police showed up, they said they were going to talk to him. They didn't take a police report. They didn't even get his name. They just did this whatever. And then they put me in the paddy wagon and they drove me, and literally it was a paddy wagon. It was great. They put me in the paddy wagon. They drove me to where I was going to go anyway. Okay. So at some point, very shortly after that, with these things that happened, what I realized is that there was a particular investment paradigm here I found it at the beginning of 2019. beginning of 2000, like January, February 2019, what had happened is the Dallas Police and Fire Pension System ended up divesting from holdings it had in Shanghai. At one point in time, it had property in both Arizona that were part of a pension fund, and it also had an interest, percentage interest in Shanghai Disney, which I was like, which you could say what you want about it, but the time frame during which they were dumping their property in both Arizona and Shanghai Disney, there were other things going on that wouldn't have made as much sense if I hadn't been in Houston during the time frame that was happening, because there was all of this swapping out going on between the Dallas pension system and the Houston pension system. Now, the other states, other cities, it's not so demonstrable. I haven't had that like real time kind of, and I haven't been able to like codify it. But there's definitely a lot of swapping that goes out between Dallas and Houston. So I found this actual paradigm, and what it was is it was a specific investment scheme that was a part of the Dallas pension system that got decommissioned 2 years ago. It got decommissioned in decommissioned in early 2018. It was actually on its way out. The last year was the year I found it, but I had already had this experience, and what it was is it was a 4-cycle type of thing. It was 4 tiers, and each tier had a different percentage, and it was a very specific element of something going on in that country. And so the one was, it was tin. It was like they had a 5% investment in tin from Nigeria. And then right after that, there was like a 2% investment in some sort of lithium battery. And so I understood that when I was having these moments with this guy, there was major, major activity that was going on in Nigeria. Usually had to do with the budget. I don't know if anybody followed it. I just happened to, get on this current somehow. And when I would check, this is what was going on, is that the Nigerian government, the Nigerian legislature was in the process of negotiating its budget. And it would get to a point where it was about to pass the budget, and then something would happen. They'd be like, we're going to postpone it. Well, it just so happened in those days that they were just going to postpone it were days where I was in a situation where I was literally being threatened, if not actually physically assaulted, up to and including by security guards, concurrent to somebody setting up a terrorist attack that was attributed to Boko Haram. I believe that specific investment scheme was a part of it, but it's not exclusive. I honestly believe that the Dallas Police and Fire Pension System specifically, literally, and strategically runs multiple investment schemas that are directly connected to activating and triggering terrorist attacks that are attributed to Boko Haram. The events are too precise. The build up and the anticipatory events that if you understand the sequences and the cycles that they're working on are too precise. And the absolute abject refusal of anybody at any level of jurisdiction in the entire fucking state of Texas since I've been here to intercede, to de-escalate, or to intervene at a moment that would literally create the severance of the process in order to prevent the terrorist attack refuses to occur over and over and over again. In Houston, in Austin, in Fort Worth, and in Dallas for over 4 years now. They just refuse. It's actually very simple. Sometimes the moment that allows for the potential recalibration of the ongoing schema could actually be quite simple. They just refuse. They just abjectly, deliberately, intentionally refuse. And they do it in a completely disgustingly disingenuous manner, and they've been doing it for years, right? So that particular investment scheme was one that was associated with some remote island. I think it was the island of Guernsey. There was an investment firm that was located on the island of Guernsey, and amongst the things it had to do with, there was the last thing it was a tin from Nigeria, lithium batteries, and then there was a certain kind of relationship, I think, with radio electronics from China. But the thing is that as much as those specific elements might have actually come from those countries, I also believe that they were derivatives. I believe that literally the tin from Nigeria is not just about actual physical tin as a commodity. I believe that what it was a reference point to some sort of tax allocation or tax process, and that they literally knew when they invested in and with that scheme that it was a form of financing a specific operationalization of a black op. I absolutely believe that the people in the Dallas police and fire pension system absolutely knew that's what it was. And that's actually why they invested in it. And that's why they dumped it the same time they dumped Shanghai, China. But the problem is that when you, even if you dump it and even if you offload it, there's some time between the time frame during which it is actually severed and the time you move on to other investments. So then the question becomes, well, what kind of investments in China right now specifically are all of these municipal pension systems involved with? Why and in what manner was it in any way, shape, or form legitimate for the Dallas police and fire pension system to be invested as a asset holder with a percentage interest in Shanghai, China, and Shanghai Disney? How is that in any way, shape, or form legitimate? I contend it was absolutely not legitimate. It was absolutely 100% intended to be a part of what are these undercurrents of cyber terrorism that are originating in the United States. There's absolutely no reason why that should have been allowed to be part of the local pension portfolio. And it's not the only one. While they divested of those, they added on other ones, right? And they have a different way of reporting it in Dallas than they do in Houston. But if if you're on these currents where they've already coded you to be a part of these processes, and they've already created this sort of automation with acts of defamation in your life and acts of securities fraud that they absolutely refuse to correct, then as I can attest, years down the fucking road, you're still working subroutines and currents connected to obsolete portfolios or obsolete pension schemes that have been dumped. But they never give you a clue. See, this is my theory, is that I've opened reports that were literally about details of schema that were part of these sorts of things I'm talking about. So even if, for instance, what I believe happened is that at least one of the reports I filed in Houston, where with I believe the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, when I was on site, when they coordinated and operationalized a terrorist attack in another country that I think that day was not specific to Boko Haram, but there was a terrorist attack on a holy site in another country, and it was orchestrated in concurrence with events that I experienced while I was at the Children's Museum, which is also a public library branch in Houston. I could hear it on a certain level, and what they were doing, I said, I know they're setting up an op. I know they are. And I could hear it on a certain level. And if I could hear it, I know they could hear it. Because at least something they could hear, because I would hear something, and then I would look at them, and then they would look at me as if to confirm what was going on in the current. They've been doing this for years. So there's no way I don't believe they don't know, right? The question is, what gives them the impunity to do that? And why hasn't anybody shut it down, right? So when this happened, I ended up sending a report to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission about what I know. I think that specific event was connected to one of those investment schemes that ended up getting dumped. As a matter of fact, once it got reported and once they saw the details, they might even have been able to identify the scheme that was financing it and thought it was too much of a risk, so they were just going to sell it off. They didn't bust anybody. They didn't prosecute anybody. And they had trafficked me to 2 cities by the time I found out about it, right? They had trafficked me to 2 other cities by the time I found out about it. But the problem is, they sent the report in. Who got the report? Who got the report? Did they open a report number? And it's still, now we're going on 3 years. Nobody's closed out any of these reports. So who ended up intercepting or seeing as part of the surveillance these reports and then thought, what are they doing with them? Are they using them as insurance? Are they using them as underwriting on new securities? Or are they trying to create them as some sort of other kind of risk-calibrated scenario that they're trying to use for their own sort of politicking? And then the question becomes, well, who's authorizing that? Who's authorizing the police, or not even the police, but private security that's subcontracted with and through the city, or subcontracted with and through nonprofit organizations that involve board members that have these, very executive level corporate positions in various kinds of companies? Who is authorizing them to have all of this clandestine activity go on while they're on the job that can be demonstrably identified to and tailored to specific investment schemes that are part of local municipal pension portfolios. That's what that showed me. What that showed me is when I found that information, and it was in the time frame it was going in, they knew they'd been busted. But rather than them being held accountable, they just said, well, we're just going to offload this asset. We don't need it anymore. Oh, did that stop them? Right? Because they obviously have set up deals based on the time frame during which they had those assets. And without there being some definitive manner in which to close them down or to address the crimes that were happening while they were the asset holders, they've been allowed to perpetuate. And that's part of what my concern is that specifically to Shanghai, the holdings from the Dallas Police pension system that were also leveraged with various schemes that were going on in Houston, that they've set up all these black ops. And so now if you do an inventory, now if you do an audit, you may not find the stuff they had a couple of years ago they've already dumped, but they already set those scenarios up. So are they just trading them? And is that part of this like metric flipping, where it starts in one municipality, goes to another? It's not even predictive. It's programmed. These things have particular cycles where they have particular options, and depending upon which metrics have been, weighted for which area, them hitting a certain place is going to allow for something to happen. And ultimately, if you allow for that kind of rotation and you refuse to address if you refuse to address incompetence or malfeasance of people on the job who won't do simple things in order to implement corrective measures or preventative measures that de-escalate before it gets to that critical or terminal moment, then it's going to happen. And so the question becomes, well, are you just not going to let me have a job? Because literally for the last 10 years, in order to get a job, you had to understand that your whole goal was to make sure the hot potato got sent somewhere else. It's like hot potato. Like literally. I mean, they literally did that. When I was in a shelter playing with young people and they played the hot potato game, I didn't realize what it was till I got down here. It's literally how you just throw it around. Oh, you don't, until you get it. And then it goes off in your fucking hand and then you got to deal with it. That they literally set it up. I mean, because that's really what it seems like. They're not going to respond until it gets to a juncture that's so critical that then they can what? Demand a federal drawdown? And then we get back to Hurricane Harvey, right? Prior to Hurricane Harvey, there were a variety of precipitating events that were happening all over Texas, but specific to that area. Up to and including whatever happened with that break in the water line in Corpus Christi. And nobody's talked about that. Nobody's investigated that. And that is just one of numerous events where there were acts of industrial sabotage that were, I believe, intentionally allowed to happen, but that are orchestrated or precipitated based upon actually torturing people who have been hooked up to illicit processes. And so it's almost like this strange thing where somebody's risking that if you get people to cooperate with the kickbacks, and if you get people to cooperate with all the illicit activity, it's not going to be as bad in your jurisdiction. But it's actually more of a risk to have somebody that thinks. And so what I've seen now is I believe that this is what Texas is doing with its confidentiality laws. It's got these new laws that it's tried to implement around making things that were previously public information confidential. Why? Well, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to recirculate that risk into public financing. It's part of what they've been doing with the pension system, with the case law around the whistleblowers, specifically to the ISDs that they like to leverage with whatever those cases were connected to Boeing, right? I've never read them because of the political reasons. I haven't read the cases that were under that Attorney General for political reasons, but I've seen some of the analysis of some of the concepts of what was addressed in the case and how it fits into the schema that is identifiable through the actual systemization that I understand is part of the pension scheme. They actually use this particular process that is reflected in this particular legal standard, these legal documents, as a way to circulate as part of the pension scheme. And you go, and when you show up, depending upon what the key is for you at that moment, depending on the option you execute in terms of how you engage determines whether you get the resources or whether you get dismissed. And it's literally, and I refuse. It's like the cricket racket, right? I'm not going to learn the rules. I'm not going to learn the rules because I don't want you to get the misimpression that I'm actually going to play along with this. If you wanted me to actually do something like that, and you need to actually get a contract for that. You need to actually get an agreement to have me do that, because then we're back to the VC trying to get people diagnosed as having a mental illness as a form of risk insurance on getting caught. And so this is what's been happening for years and years and years. So I mean, are you trying to cover your ass? You got like somebody's coming in trying to put the thumb screws to you. You got to try to figure out if you can figure what. What are you gonna slide some shit in to try to cover up a couple of areas for yourself? Where are you right now?